Welcome to your ultimate pit stop, Piston Pundit. Canada's diplomatic landscape is shifting gears, and it's not just a minor lane change, it's a full-on detour. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is distancing itself from its long-standing reliance on the United States and forging new alliances with Europe. The recent high-profile meetings with French President Macron and British Prime Minister Starmer suggests that Canada is ready to redefine its position on the global stage. So, why is Canada pivoting toward Europe? And what could this mean for its historically tight relationship with the US? Let's break it down. Number 1. Shifting gears. Why Canada is reassessing its US alliance. Canada and the US have shared one of the most stable economic and strategic alliances for decades, until recently. The turning point came when the Trump administration imposed steep tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automotive parts. The fallout was swift and severe. Canadian manufacturers, already feeling the heat from global supply chain issues, faced higher costs and reduced market access. After Trump's re-election brought more tariffs targeting Canadian exports, Ottawa was left with no choice but to reconsider its dependency on Washington. Canadian automakers and agricultural producers took the hardest hit, and Prime Minister Mark Carney knew that a response was inevitable. Carney, a financial heavyweight with experience leading both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, saw an opportunity in the crisis. Instead of clinging to the American market, Carney pivoted toward Europe and Asia to diversify Canada's trade dependencies. This wasn't just a financial move, it was a political statement. His decision to visit Paris and London before Washington was a clear signal. Canada was ready to stand on its own. The message was unmistakable. Canada would no longer tolerate being treated as a junior partner. This diplomatic shift could fundamentally alter North American power dynamics, and Washington is watching closely. But trade isn't the only area where Canada is shifting its focus. Carney's economic strategy is just as ambitious. Number 2. Economic realignment, strengthening ties with Europe. Carney's first international trip as Prime Minister took him to Paris and London, a pointed departure from the tradition of visiting Washington first. His meetings with French President Macron and British Prime Minister Starmer weren't just symbolic, they were strategic. In Paris, Carney and Macron focused on expanding trade and financial cooperation. Macron floated the idea of joint working groups on defense, energy, and technology, signaling that France was ready to treat Canada as a full-fledged strategic partner, not just an appendage of the US. Meanwhile, in London, Carney tapped into his past relationships at the Bank of England. With Britain still grappling with post-Brexit trade challenges, Canada presented itself as a natural partner due to shared financial systems, language, and historical ties. Early agreements were reached to increase bilateral trade and explore defense collaboration, another indication that Canada was moving away from Washington's orbit. For decades, over 75% of Canadian exports have been destined for the US market. Diversifying toward Europe and Asia reduces that dependency and gives Canada more leverage in future trade negotiations with Washington. But this shift isn't without risks. If the US responds with retaliatory tariffs or trade barriers, Canada could face an economic backlash. Carney, however, seems ready to take that gamble. He's betting that a diversified trade portfolio will make Canada more resilient to US economic pressure in the long run. It's a bold play, but one that reflects Canada's growing confidence on the global stage. But Canada's evolving trade strategy isn't the only factor at play. Defense is becoming an even bigger sticking point. Before we delve deeper, do us a favor and smash that like and subscribe button. This helps us reach more auto enthusiasts just like you. Now let's shift gears and steer towards our next point. Number 3. The defense dilemma. The F-35 kill switch controversy. Canada's defense strategy is facing a major shakeup over the controversial F-35 fighter jet program. Canada has invested billions into the US-led program, but reports of a rumored kill switch have raised serious concerns. Allegedly, this software feature would allow the US to disable the F-35 remotely, in a diplomatic or military conflict, leaving Canada powerless over its own defense assets. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government is now considering pulling out of the F-35 program, citing sovereignty and security issues. This would be a significant blow to the Pentagon's long-term defense strategy, as the F-35 was designed to serve as the backbone of Allied air power. Rather than relying solely on American-built jets, Carney has opened talks with European defense contractors. German and French firms have reportedly offered next-generation fighters without the control limitations imposed by the US. This shift reflects Canada's broader push to assert greater independence in defense policy. Washington has responded cautiously, warning that leaving the F-35 program could isolate Canada from future NATO defense projects. However, Carney's team remains firm. Maintaining full operational control over Canada's defense systems is non-negotiable. But defense isn't the only area where Canada is asserting its independence. Arctic sovereignty is becoming another major flashpoint. Number 4. Strategic sovereignty. The Arctic standoff with the US. Arctic sovereignty has become a flashpoint in US-Canada relations as melting ice caps open new trade routes and reveal valuable natural resources. The US views much of the Arctic as international waters, but Canada insists these are sovereign territories, and Prime Minister Mark Carney isn't backing down. Under Carney's leadership, Canada has reinforced its territorial claims by increasing its military presence in the Arctic. This tougher stance signals that Canada is no longer content to play a supporting role in North American security. Carney's diplomatic pivot to Europe is partly driven by Arctic security. European allies, including the UK, have voiced support for Canada's territorial claims. France and Germany have indicated they would back Canada's push for greater recognition under international law, a move that could reshape Arctic geopolitics. This shift reflects Canada's broader strategy to reduce dependence on US protection. By aligning more closely with Europe, Carney aims to strengthen Canada's position as an independent power. But asserting independence in defense and trade has its risks, and the US is already responding. Number 5. Retaliation and trade wars. What comes next? Canada's diplomatic pivot isn't sitting well with Washington, and the economic blowback has already begun. The US has threatened to impose new tariffs on Canadian exports, including agricultural products, automotive parts, and energy. If these tariffs stick, they could spark a full-blown trade war between the two allies. Carney, however, seems prepared for the fallout. His government has accelerated trade talks with the EU and Asian markets, hoping to offset any losses from reduced US market access. Early agreements with the EU on agricultural and energy exports suggest that Canada's strategy is already gaining traction. Canadian manufacturers and farmers could face short-term pain if US tariffs increase, but Carney is playing the long game. Diversifying trade relationships with Europe and Asia would make Canada more resilient to American economic pressure in the future. So where does this leave Canada, and what's the long-term game plan? The road ahead? Will Canada's gamble pay off? Mark Carney's pivot toward Europe is a bold but risky move. Strengthening ties with Paris and London opens up new economic and strategic opportunities, but the threat of US retaliation casts a long shadow. The F-35 kill switch controversy underscores the bigger issue of sovereignty. Can Canada maintain control over its defense systems, or will Washington keep the upper hand? The Arctic standoff adds another layer of complexity. Carney's strategy is clearly aimed at reducing reliance on the US, but will it backfire if trade tensions escalate into a full-blown trade war? What do you think? Should Canada stick with the F-35 program or seek European-built alternatives? Is Carney's Arctic strategy a smart play or a diplomatic gamble? Will strengthening ties with Europe give Canada more leverage, or will it strain relations with Washington beyond repair? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We love to hear from you. For the latest updates on the automotive world and more in-depth analysis, subscribe to Piston Pundit and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching. You're awesome. Stick around and check out the videos on the screen. There's plenty more to explore.